Welcome to episode 189 of 10-Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about Leon Thomas's debut album on the famous Flying Dutchman label from 1969, Spirits Known and Unknown. And this is an original 1969 US pressing. Again, as I say, on the famous Flying Dutchman label, founded by Bob Thiel. It says New Vocal Frontiers, which is code for lots of jazz yodeling. Thomas is, of course, a unique singer in the jazz canon. He was voted Best Jazz Vocalist between 1970 and 1973 by Downbeat readers. He's also a huge influence on people like Al Jarreau and Bobby McFerrin. Although active as a singer from the late 1950s on, he first becomes truly famous in jazz in the late 60s due to his work with Pharoah Sanders, a saxophonist, particularly on the album Karma. That record, of course, features the 30-minute plus track The Creator Has a Master Plan, lyrics written by Thomas and the music written by Sanders, and that track in turn features Thomas's unique vocal delivery, particularly his yodeling style. This album was recorded 8 months after that date and features a very similar lineup of musicians, including Pharoah Sanders, but he's not credited here because at this point he's signed an exclusive deal with Impulse Records, and so he has to appear uncredited, or he's actually credited as Little Rock, which is his hometown. Leon Thomas was born in 1937 in East St. Louis, Illinois. St. Louis in the middle part of the 20th century had a pretty significant music scene. Of course, that's where Miles Davis comes from, or those parts anyway. As a kid, Thomas was a talented singer and he grew up singing in the church. In his teens, he'd be invited to come and do guest spots with various choirs around town. He also sang with the saxophonist Jimmy Forrest and with the guitarist Grant Green. He was endlessly inventive in trying to expand the range of what his voice was capable of, and a key moment occurs for him in February 1957 when the Miles Davis Sextet, along with John Coltrane, who was in his pre-rehab days, shows up and blows Thomas's mind. And as he remarked to his brother afterwards, Coltrane was basically doing with his sax what he wanted to do with his voice. After this, while he pursues some studies in music at Tennessee State, he realizes he needs to move to New York to join the big time, so he moves there in 1958. Within a year, he played the Apollo Theater, and he also went on a tour which featured as the headliners Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. He worked with the multi-reed player Roland Kirk, he worked with the pianist Mary Lou Williams, and eventually he replaced Joe Williams as the lead singer in the Count Basie Orchestra in 1961. That year started off with the Basie Orchestra, with Thomas in tow, playing the Kennedy inauguration. He then toured widely with Basie, didn't make very many recordings, and then in 1962 he was drafted into the Army. When he's discharged in 1964, he returns to the Basie Orchestra just in time to play the Johnson inaugural, but he's getting more interested in pursuing his own distinct solo career and away from the sound of Basie, as good as it was. He also maintained his interest in pursuing different kinds of vocal styles. Now, his most distinctive technique is he breaks out during his singing into a kind of yodeling. And there are two different versions of how he comes to develop this technique. The first of those was that in the mid-1960s, after he left Basie, he was hanging around with the crowd. He was very into Africa, into the Far East, into yoga, into meditation, and he began to look to these kinds of influences to alter and expand his vocal techniques. The second version, which also involves yoga, has it that this technique is actually developed a little bit later on when he first started to work with Pharoah Sanders. One of the very first things that he did with Sanders was commit to a benefit gig for a group of anti-police brutality activists in New York. He's getting ready for the gig, he's doing yoga, he's doing a headstand, and he falls somehow and smashes his mouth, breaks 8 teeth. Anyway, goes to the hospital. His mouth is full of stitches. Sanders shows up and says, "Well, this is too bad, but you can't cancel on the gig, you got to make it." Thomas tells the eventual story of the gig as follows. "When it came time for me to scat, I realized that the ancestors had arrived and given me throat articulation. They said to me, 'You will sing like this with your mouth closed.' This voice is not me, my voice is ancient." Pharoah just raised his eyebrows at me. Whichever of these is true, it's indisputable that his happening to play with Sanders was really his first big break, which is kind of a funny thing to say about a guy who had sung with the Basie Orchestra and had already played 2 presidential inaugural balls. The Sanders connection happens when Leon is playing a bunch of dates in Brooklyn with a guy called Randy Weston, and into the club come Pharoah Sanders and Archie Shepp, 2 legendary avant-garde saxophonists. They love the sound, it's a recurring series of gigs, and they keep coming back to hear them again, and they start getting up on stage and jamming with them and so on, and there's a real musical connection, particularly between Thomas and Pharoah. Eventually, Pharoah says to Thomas, "Look, I've got this piece called Pisces Moon. It's a long piece, it's my regular set. I want to set some words to it, but I'm not a lyricist. Would you write some lyrics?" And Thomas says, "Sure." So he takes it away into a corner and comes back a few days later with the lyrics to The Creator Has a Master Plan, and thus a classic is born. This leads to a 3-year partnership, which starts off with Sanders' album Karma, where, of course, Thomas does this legendary singing. Also includes great albums like Jewels of Thought and Azifo Zam. This record is made October 21st and 22nd, 1969 in New York, and Bob Thiel is the producer. It's got a live audience of sorts. Whether it's a group of people in the studio or whether they're playing at a club is not clear. The cover's no help. The internet is inconclusive. If you do know, please put a comment down below. As mentioned, this is one of the very first Flying Dutchman releases. Thiel, of course, had a phenomenal career at Impulse, where he joined the label shortly after Creed Taylor had jumped ship to Verve after setting Impulse up. And he had produced probably the single greatest body of work of any producer of jazz in the 1960s while he was at Impulse, including, of course, so many great records by John Coltrane. Flying Dutchman would go on to release all kinds of great records by people like Gil Scott-Heron, Gato Barbieri, Lonnie Liston Smith, but this is the first jazz record as such to really make a splash for the label. The lineup is Leon Thomas on vocals, Pharoah Sanders on tenor sax, though as I mentioned, he's credited as Little Rock, James Spaulding on alto sax and on flute. He was a veteran of the 1950s until about 61 with Sun Ra, but then he spent much of the 60s playing with Freddie Hubbard. On bass, this record is remarkable for having not just one, but both, arguably, of the two best avant-garde bassists around at the time, Cecil McBee and Richard Davis. Roy Haynes is on drums. He's still going, actually, at 96, the 8-time winner of the Critics' Poll for Best Drummer in Downbeat. Lonnie Liston Smith is on piano, and Richard Landrum, who was a percussionist who'd made his name playing for Rahsaan Roland Kirk and for Grant Green, is on bongos. The title of the album is taken from a review of Pharoah Sanders' Karma in Jazz and Pop magazine, written by a guy called Will Smith, not the Will Smith, I don't think, in which he says, "The voice projection of the lyrics is good and full and leads to a wordless yodel, sounding not unlike an American Indian call, the moaning of spirits known and unknown." I'm not so sure about that comparison, but there can be no doubt there are no other singers like Leon Thomas. Side 1 starts with The Creator Has a Master Plan, the very track which had brought Thomas to fame earlier on Karma. This is a wonderfully beautiful rendition of this song. It's much more concise and accessible than the version on Karma, which of course is 30 plus minutes. Pharoah's much more restrained here, and this did quite well on the radio. The next track, 1, gives Pharoah more room to stretch out. It also brings to the limelight for the first time the amazing Lonnie Liston Smith, whose work is excellent all the way through this record. All of that work surrounds some quite amazing yodeling and scat from Leon. The third track, Echoes, gives one even more reason to single out the excellent rhythmic work by Lonnie Liston Smith. He would eventually, of course, go on to have his own great career with Flying Dutchman as a solo artist with the Cosmic Echoes. This song is perhaps the best showcase for the more conventional side of Thomas's vocals on the record. It's also got some wonderfully inventive flute playing by James Spaulding, but my mind just keeps returning back to that wonderfully rhythmic piano work by Smith. The last track on side 1, Song for My Father, is of course a cover of the famous song by Horace Silver. The lyrics on this are a little bit Hallmark cards, and of course Silver's song didn't originally have lyrics, but people started writing lyrics to it, including Ellen May Shoshone, who writes the lyrics here that Thomas sings. Eventually, Silver realized that people were adding lyrics to his tune and decided to write his own. The ones that he writes are actually really quite interesting. They're all about coming to terms with understanding his father's music, with whom he had a difficult relationship and so on. These lyrics aren't quite all that. Side 2 starts with Damn Nam Ain't Going to Vietnam, which is basically a rant set over a hard bop number. And that leads into what, with the title track, is probably one of the two real highlights of this record, which is Malcolm's Gone. No doubt about the fact this is a powerful track. It's one of the great pieces of music from the early Black Power era when optimism was now in short supply. The final track, compared to some of the stuff which has gone before, is quite conventional, Let the Rain Fall on Me, which of course was a standard for the Ellington Orchestra. The main word I have to describe this record is gorgeous. Thomas's voice is rich and velvety. The yodeling is largely not excessive. The variety on the record is excellent. The players are top-notch. McBee, Davis, Sanders, Smith, Spaulding, and I haven't even had time in all of this to mention Roy Haynes. If Thomas has an Achilles heel, it's sometimes the lyrics, and it is true that they sound a little bit dated, which is not their fault because time passes, and also sometimes a little bit naive or even a bit trite. If that's true, it's kind of the other side of the coin for the beauty and innocence he's often able to summon, so I think it's kind of hard to have one without the other. Overall, this album is generally excellent. It's a must for anybody who's interested in spiritual jazz. I give it 4.5 out of 5 stars.